Greetings and salutations, my horticultural friends, and welcome to another noontime presentation of As the Webinar Turns. I'm Chris Beatty, editor of Growertalks magazine and Green Profit magazine and the newsletter Acres Online. And today's heart-pounding episode is perennial plants for every season, or the right material at the right time. And happy Valentine's Day, everybody. This is our first ever Valentine's Day webinar. And in honor of that, the theme song today was called Deeply in Love. Yes, that is correct. Now, if there's one thing I know about you perennial people, it's that you cannot get enough cultural information on your favorite crops, which is why I love doing webinars on perennials, because we all learn something new every time. And the chap that we are going to be learning from today is a veteran of these Growertalks webinars. He is my friend Jeremy Windemuller, trial manager for Walter's Gardens. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks, Chris.
All right. Where are you broadcasting from today, Jeremy?
Our conference room at the office at Walter's Gardens.
In Michigan?
Yes, Michigan.
Beautiful. And you say our conference room, but it's not going to be your conference room for long. Is that right?
Correct. I am leaving Walters on March 30 and heading on my own for my own nursery and my landscaping business. I've been operating for about 18 years, kind of as a hobby, and now making that a full-time business.
Well, that's exciting. So congratulations. Going out and breaking into your own business world. It's not as much fun as it looks like. I agree now. But I'm sure you'll do great. And we'll make sure your contact information at the very end is such that if somebody watches this webinar 6 months from now, they'll still be able to find you. They'll track you down. All right. And for myself, I'm broadcasting from someplace different today. I'm broadcasting from my home office high atop the Conway Court Conservatory in South Elgin, Illinois. And that's because about 45 minutes after the webinar is over, I'm going to hop a flight to Australia and then Tasmania shortly after that. So stay tuned for some of my adventures from down under. But for now, the adventure is all about today's webinar. So some housekeeping. First, I'm seeing a few Q&As pop in here, a few questions. Carl says no picture. That's pretty odd. I can't help you with that one, Carl. I assume everybody else has got an image showing up. Jeremy, you can see this slide, right?
Yes.
That's good. Okay. For those who can't hear, though, and sometimes that happens, we get no audio. They just need to read this little slide right here, and that makes them go, I got it. Pull down this thing, click on that. Now we can hear. Beautiful. Other things, if you have questions as we go along, you can use either the chat area or the Q&A area that you see on the side of the screen there. And we'll tackle them as we go along if they're pertinent to what Jeremy happens to be talking about right then. Otherwise, we'll save them for the end. So that said, one more thing. If for any reason, for instance, Ellen, you got to go walk your dog or a customer comes in, this webinar will be archived probably within 45 minutes or so from the time the webinar ends. So stay tuned for that. That's pretty much it, I think. Jeremy, you ready to go?
I am.
All right. Take it away.
All right. Well, I'm excited to speak with you guys today about my experiences with growing perennials and kind of hoping I can break the mold a little bit for some growers. I know when I started growing perennials, spring planting is all I could think about. Generally just did bare root, planted some larger plugs in the spring. But as I gained more experience growing perennials, I really found it beneficial to start looking at planting certain crops in the summer months, late summer, going into fall. I've seen great results with that. I know it's not set up for every grower out there, but if you can figure out any way to modify your growing strategies to incorporate some of the late summer planting, I think you'll really see a great benefits from that. And we'll kind of go through that throughout the slides here. I'll kind of talk about what to plant and when, as well as some of the cultural information for that, and then also show you some photos of some of the results that we've had and some of the trials of different crops we've grown throughout different seasons. So go ahead and move to the next slide there. Current common practice, most growers do plant perennials in late winter to spring. I know not everyone does it this way, but a lot of people do it because they've just done it that way for a long time, and it's hard to break something into something different. So yeah, just open your mind to some of these ideas, and I'll show you some of the results. So generally, small plugs planted in the spring require a lot more attention, especially growing under lower light levels. I find that if you take like a 72 count plug in the spring, for example, it requires several pinches to really get the branching to develop that's desired to finish out a 1 gallon container. So that's just all added cost into planting that small plug in the spring. And then while many perennials do well planted in the spring, there are many that do benefit from late summer planting, and many even earlier in the season. So we'll roll through some of those as we go. So why is it better to plant in the summer and fall? And these are some of the reasons I've come up with that I've seen that have been very valuable to me. And biggest thing I notice as a grower is the faster production time. It takes a lot less time to finish a perennial under the prime conditions than it does to try to finish it in the late winter, early spring. And primarily because obviously you have great light levels. Artificial lights, all the LED lights you can throw at these plants just does not compare to what the sun can do for the plants. So having great light levels is very, very important in production. Warm temperatures, and the biggest thing with warm temperatures is in the summers you don't have to pay for it, it's just there. So plants finish much quicker under the warmer temperatures, and they tend to root out much quicker. So it's a cost savings for a grower not to have to be putting supplemental heat in a greenhouse to try to bulk up plants prior to sales. And then also, one thing I noticed too is we're all busy in the spring. Being greenhouse growers or perennial growers, that's our busy time of year. So why not look at options to move some of these crops to a different season, take a little bit of that stress off of the planting time in the spring, and put it to a different season when maybe we're not so busy. And then another thing I like about too with this type of growing method is that plants can be grown outside. I am a big fan of growing most perennials outside. It's really an ideal area to grow. You're not under plastic. You're getting all the direct UV light for a lot of these different perennials that require that to get the dark foliage. And it's very inexpensive space to produce. For an outdoor growing production space, it's much less expensive than putting up greenhouse frames or cold frames. And then another thing too is that the plants bulk quicker with less attention. So like I mentioned earlier with planting small plugs in the spring, is they require going back and pinching several times to get the plants to bulk up. So the labor savings with that as well is really, really important. Finished plants can also be vernalized for early spring forcing. So a lot of the perennials that bloom in early spring, and I'll have a list on the next slide shortly here, but they really benefit from being bulked up the season prior, where they stay vegetative throughout the summer months. So it's much easier to get them to the size that you need. You can then vernalize a fully grown plant, and then once spring comes around, it makes it much easier to force for early season sales. I know there's a lot of growers ask, how can I create a perennial program that I can get some early season flower color for the garden center? Well, by planting this time of year in the summer, that allows you to do so much easier than trying to bring in vernalized plugs earlier on in the season. So here's a list of some of the spring blooming plants that I recommend to look at planting in summer and fall. Aquilegia, Armeria, going down the list here, these are all plants that really bloom quickly from a vernalized plug. So generally you're going to see the flowers forming on a plug before it really bulks up to be the size of the pot. So either you're having to go in there and pinch flowers off to continue that plant to help that plant to continue to bulk, or you may end up removing flowers and the plant will not rebloom the rest of the season. So then you're pretty much out of luck. This is really important, especially with plants like Primula, pulmonaria. A lot of those are, they're pretty much a one shot and they're done for the season. And then I also added heuchera and heucherella in here. Walter's Gardens has done a lot of breeding work, bringing a lot of the coral bell flowers back into the plants, into the heucheras, that you have the total package. So they're not just a foliage plant, they're a flowering plant as well. So with those added, with the added benefit of having a nice flowering plant, you want to look at planting these plants in late summer to bulk, and then you can vernalize that plant and have a load of flowers on there. So just my experience from planting vernalized plug is you may have maybe about a dozen flower stems coming up on a heuchera plant, but if you plant that same plug or even a smaller plug the year prior in late summer and you vernalize that finished plant, you're going to end up with double to triple the amount of flower stems on a plant. So it really makes it a more desirable plant at retail. Here's an example of what I was talking about. So on the left we have Heucherella Pink Fizz, and on the right we have Heuchera Berry Timeless. And now these are both heavy flowering types. And what you see here were 72 count plugs put into a 4-quart or a true 1 gallon container in late July, early August in Michigan here, and then grown out, vernalized, and then forced at a cooler temperature, about 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So by having that finished plant, you're able to force that much cooler temperatures because you're not worrying about developing the roots in there. It's already there. So all you're doing is flushing out the top and getting a nice full flush of flowers. And now who wouldn't like something like this at retail? It's a nice impulse item for early season sales. So stuff like this should fly off the benches, but it just takes growing at a certain time of year to achieve these kind of results. I'm getting into some of the other crops that I recommend for summer and fall bulking. A lot of these plants like a lot of heat. Some of them don't so much. So you got to utilize shade cloth to really kind of keep them cool. But things like Asclepias tuberosa, that's a plant that loves a lot of heat, and it's very, very difficult to try to grow in the spring, even from a larger plug or bare root. It just loves a lot of heat. So I typically get 72 count plugs in midsummer, and they take right off. Again, you got to watch the moisture, keep on the drier side, but plants like that take right off just wonderfully during the summer. Other plants like ferns, getting the root system developed before going into the fall and having a nice full container, you end up with a beautiful plant the season afterwards for spring sales, and it just looks much nicer than a larger 20 count plug would look in the spring. Now, some of these items take a lot of time to bulk as well, so things like some of the newer Monarda that are more compact in size, that they take longer than the old larger garden type Monardas. So just keep that in mind. That's why we recommend some of these plugs be planted in summer. The older garden type Monardas, you could easily do that in spring because they just take over pretty quickly. But you see a good benefit from that for a lot of these more compact items. Cool season grasses, obviously, doing those more into the fall when the temperatures start cooling down. And then things like leucanthemum, that I'm a big fan of getting those started in late July, early August. I've seen great results with nice full containers and about triple the flower or bud count on those plants as well. So it's really important to choose the right type of media when growing for a long period of time. You want a media that's going to hold up well, and it's going to have good porosity, good drainage. And so these are all key things to think about when choosing a media. So this is an example of a recipe that I currently use at Walter's Gardens for all our trade show material, for a lot of our larger samples and stuff. So it's made up of mostly pine bark, have a little bit of peat moss in there to help retain some moisture, and then we use a coarse screened perlite as well. And this mix really, really works well for us, and it's good general all-around mix. Now there's a few things that I might look at adding some more perlite in there just to help increase that drainage. But for most perennials, this will do really well for them. So some tips on planting plugs. It's really important to make sure that you water the plants in thoroughly after transplanting. You want to thoroughly soak that media all the way through, and then allow it to dry slightly in between irrigation cycles. And what that does is it really, really helps the plant to push out those new feeder roots and to develop those roots and search for that moisture. If that soil is consistently wet all the time, that plug is pretty much happy where it's at. It's not going to send out a lot of roots. So you want to encourage those roots to go to the bottom of the pot or to the side of the pot. And that's done so by keeping it slightly dry. Most plugs should be planted with the top of the soil line in the plug, even with the top of the soil line in the container. If not, just a slight amount of soil above it, just to keep that plug from drying out. And it's really important too that, I didn't put this in the slide, but it's really important too that you water the plugs in thoroughly in the plug tray before you transplant into a container. If you put a dry plug into a container and try to moisten it up, it's very difficult for that small plug to try to wick in that moisture if that peat moss in that plug is extremely dry. So I found it very beneficial to soak the plugs or to drench the plugs down with water days before planting.
Questions popped in. Let's see. Jason wants to know, and this is let's see, about vernalizing heuchera and heucherella.
Sure.
Some winters, are they sensitive to certain temperatures, moisture levels, etc.? Not sure if this is a great time to ask it, or if we'll address that later, but why not tackle it now?
Well, it's a pretty specific question there, so we can address it now. So with heucherella and heuchera, I think the best environment for them is to be in a minimally heated greenhouse, which would be 35 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with good ventilation or ventilation, and it's really important that you have white poly obviously on there to keep the temperatures from swinging too high and too low. So consistent cool temperature is really important. I generally like the moderately heated greenhouses because I don't have to add extra protection on top of the crop. Anytime that you put a frost blanket on top of coral bells or heucherella in a cold frame, you end up building a microclimate in there, and it just retains a lot of humidity and moisture. In my own nursery this past year, I covered a lot of those up in a unheated hoop house that I have. I don't have any heated space. And I put a 3-ounce frost blanket on them. And when I uncovered those, they're about midwinter here, because we had a warm day, I noticed a lot of botrytis in there. So we had to go back and spray a lot of those. So ideally, you can get away with a lot less treatment for botrytis if you have an environment where you can vent and you're not covering them up.
Okay. Carl, who has his picture now, beautiful. He wants to know, back to your potting media slide, what's your pH that you like to run?
So for most perennials, anywhere between 5.8 and 6.5 is the ideal pH that you're looking for when growing perennials. You can check our cultural sheets at waltersgardens.com if you have something more specific for a certain crop that you're growing. But in general, that's the idea growing pH range that we're looking for. All
right. Beautiful. Keep the questions coming. Okay, we done with this slide, Jeremy, or want me to stay here?
I didn't hit on pinches yet. So for most small plugs, it is beneficial to give a soft pinch. So usually you can either look at the plug and decide if it needs it at transplant, or I typically like to wait a week or two after transplanting, allow some of those roots to set a little bit, and then I'll go in there and give it a soft pinch. And it just helps increase the basal branching. So I'll hit on a few bare root perennial tips here. There are some bare root plants that we do recommend planting in the summer, and that would fall under like daylilies and hostas. Those are our big bare root items throughout the whole summer. And the reason is the long days really, really help with the bulking and the rooting of those plants. And you end up with a much nicer plant the following season. So most bare root plants should be planted with the crown at or slightly below the soil line. So with hostas, I am a fan of getting the eye slightly below the soil line. You don't really want to see much exposed whatsoever. Now with daylilies, I usually bury the crown just slightly, just below the soil line, and then those fans will be pretty much exposed. You don't want to bury those stands below the soil line. You'll end up having crown rot set in on you after a certain amount of time. And it's real important too to water in bare root plants thoroughly. This is even more so in plugs because you do have more of a chance for air pockets when dealing with bare root plants, just because of the larger root system. If that root system is spread out, it's really, really key to check underneath the crown to make sure that the soil's all pushed in there and that you avoid any of those large voids that can cause you problems down the road. And then once you water it in thoroughly, then allow it to dry slightly again, and that really, again, encourages those new feeder roots to develop and seek out the moisture. So I would actually hold bare root slightly drier than what I would hold a 1 gallon container from a plug, just from the fact that you're really trying to push those roots out. And then it's also really important not to begin feeding bare root perennials until those new feeder roots develop. There's no way for that plant to take up those nutrients there. So I usually wait 1 to 2 weeks after transplanting. Obviously, if you're incorporating a fertilizer in the media, you really can't get away from that, but hopefully it won't be releasing too much anyways at that point. But if you're doing a liquid feed program, avoid doing any kind of application with fertilizer until about 1 to 2 weeks after transplanting. Placing plants in a cooler environment is probably the best idea with bare root. You want to encourage those roots to develop before you push a lot of top growth. And this is really important with plants like a stilby. They tend to flush out really, really quick, or clematis would be another one too. You want to develop those roots before that top really starts to form. So here's a slide that shows you an example of some of the bare root plants that we offer at Walter's Gardens. In the photo is some daylilies. This is Happy Returns, which is a grade 1, so a fairly nice sized plant there. And that's great for a 1 or 2 gallon container. And then you can expect around 6 to 8 week finish time with those in the summer months. Slightly slower in the spring or late winter, early spring if you're planting that time of year. But grade 2 is a great option for 1 gallon containers, and especially if a grower is looking at getting large quantities in to plant in late summer for the following spring sales. I tend to go for a grade 2 because of the lower costs of the plant, and it will fill out a trade gallon just as nice as can be in the late summer. And you can expect around 7 to 9 weeks finish time on a plant like that. And then on a few specific varieties, we offer grade 3 bare root. Now this is great for a grower that wants to do quarts or, again, trade gallons for an extremely low input cost. And again, I would highly recommend any kind of grade 3 bare root to be planted the summer prior.
Jeremy, quick question on going back to your fertilizer recommendation. Brad wanted a clarification about fertilizing plugs. You said don't do it directly after planting. You wanted to wait a couple of weeks, right?
Well, that's typically for bare root because, again, you don't have those feeder roots develop. Plugs can take some of that up because obviously it's an actively growing plug. If it's a fully hard dormant plant, then I'd probably wait a little bit until it starts waking up. But if you have something that has a fresh top to it that looks like it's actively growing, maybe came out of a warm house rather than shipped dormant, then I would start feeding it.
And then wait a bit. An actively growing plug, you can feed right away.
Correct. Yep. And it depends what kind of media you use. If you use a commercial media that has a starter charge in there, that's probably enough to carry you for a little bit there. But yeah, if it's an actively growing plug, I would probably put some fertilizer on there right away.
All right. A question about potting, but I know you're going to get into that in just a little bit. So I think we'll address air pockets at the time. Mention that.
Okay. So fungicide drenches, this is really important with bare root crops. Again, they come out of a field, so it's really important that you do a fungicide drench on a majority of these items. I just find it beneficial to do that. It really helps prevent some possible issues down the road as far as root and crown rots go. So I'd rather take preventative measures than trying to cure something when you're on the brink of losing a crop or something like that. So it's really, really important to look at what would be the best chemical for your situation. Some different chemicals I've used in the past would be like Banrot, Pageant seems to work really well, Subdue Max, and Truban. And then you'll see my little pointer at the bottom there. Do not apply Banrot or Truban to clematis. So you'll have problems with that. So I learned that a few years ago. And next slide there. So now we can talk about boosting late season sales. So not only can you use bare root to plant for the season, for the following season in the summer, but Walters has started offering bare root dormant plants as late as late June. And I find this beneficial as a nursery grower, because now I can look at, well, what can I do for late summer sales? I can do a 2-gallon program for great impulse sales. And the photo you see there on the bottom, the slide, those are all 2-gallon plants that were planted directly outdoors from bare root in mid-May. So it'd be a mid-May planting, and you can carry that. And then I think this at our summer tours in August, in early August, a couple years ago. And I got an error here on my computer, sorry. So they're pretty much a quick turn because of, again, the wonderful growing conditions that you have. You can figure around 6 to 8 weeks, even in the larger container. But again, you're starting from a nice beefy sized bare root plant with lots of eyes. So there's really no pinching and no extra work required. Since it is the prime heat time of the season there, the warmer temperatures, you might have to look at doing a PGR application on some of these plants. But other than that, they're very, very easy to care for. So something to think about when you're preparing to overwinter plants. The biggest thing I see growers make a mistake with when planting in late summers is they sometimes might get plants in too late. Maybe they sold out and they wanted to add some more. It's just really important to get that plant bulked properly before going into the dormancy. Especially when you think of crops like echinacea that a lot of people struggle with. A lot of it comes down to just poorly rooted plants or just too young of plants going into the cold. So the photo you see there is an example of a trade gallon Monarda. So it's just the outside of the container that's ideal, and then it had a nice white full root system throughout the whole pot. So it's a plant that's definitely ready to go into dormancy. And then once plants are ready for dormancy and your temperatures start cooling down, you notice that the growth slows, and then you might see a little bit of change in color of the foliage and stuff. You want to start cutting back the feed rates at that point. I typically cut them in half. I've heard some growers just stop feeding entirely, but there's still some activity with that plant. So make sure that you're feeding it something, but just not a full rate. And that's where the next step comes into play here is it's important to check your soil. Do soil tests periodically to check for elevated EC levels. I see it so often where growers just neglect to do just standard soil tests. They're very easy to do, but it can make a world of difference going into dormancy. If you have a plant that's going into dormancy with elevated EC levels, that the salt buildup around the crown can start causing crown rot. It can cause the roots to burn, and it'll just add up to being more problems as that plant goes through dormancy. So if you do have elevated EC levels, it's necessary to leach the crop. And we have all this information again on our culture sheets on our website at waltersgardens.com. So be sure to check that out. We have recommended EC and pH levels for everything there. And then we also have a YouTube video that actually shows you how to do pour-through testing, soil testing. And so that's real helpful just to get you started. And then just invest in an inexpensive pH and EC meter. I think you can get something for less than a couple $100, and it really, really pays for itself in a hurry. And then you want to trim dormant tops before going, or before the plants are covered up for the winter. And that's real important because you don't want to leave a lot of dead material at the crown, as it could cause a lot of botrytis and just another house for rodents and stuff. So it's really important to remove all that foliage. But I will say, just avoid removing it too early. If it's extremely green yet, allow those nutrients to go down to the roots. You're going to have a much happier plant coming out of dormancy that way. So again, like I said, some of these crops are susceptible to root and crown diseases, so it could benefit again from a late summer fungicide drench before temperatures cool. So you want to make sure you hit that on time. If the plants are already starting to go dormant, there's not much activity with the plants, so it's probably not the best time to apply a fungicide. But make sure you hit that on time as a preventative. And then be sure the crop has moderate moisture going into dormancy. Do not allow that plant to go into dormancy extremely sopping wet or extremely dry. You're going to have a lot of problems with that because you won't be able to get any kind of moisture back in that plant once it freezes. And then like I mentioned earlier too, the best environment to overwinter perennials is in a minimally heated greenhouse with white poly. Again, you want to keep the temperatures consistent. If you don't have power venting in there, make sure that you're monitoring the weather and getting in there and opening those doors up if it gets above freezing. You want to keep those temperatures consistent. The big temperature swings are what tend to cause the plants to wake up if it happens for a prolonged period of time. And then you get these big drops in temperature that will cause a lot of problems. And then my number one thing I'll mention to everyone is bait for rodents. I've learned the hard way on this one, where one season I didn't put enough bait out there, and I had a lot of hellebores eaten up, which was surprising to me. It's an expensive crop to lose, but that's one I make sure that I bait liberally around. So that is something that I can't do enough of. So just keep an eye out for rodents.
Jeremy, quick question from Rodney. He wants to know why white poly?
Well, white poly will keep the sun from heating up a greenhouse. So imagine, what it feels like to be under clear poly if you had a sunny day in the middle of winter. It could be 5 degrees outside, but if you have a sunny day, that greenhouse could easily heat up in the 50s and 60s if it's not being vented. So the white poly keeps the radiant temperature from building up in the greenhouse.
Sure, it acts as a bit of shade, plus sure. The white diffuses the light more than the clear.
Correct, yep.
All right. And any recommendations on rodent bait, real quickly?
I tend to like to use a mixture of different brands and different active ingredients in there. So don't just put like one type of rodent bait out there. Do your research on it. There's lots of different types. There's an anticoagulant and all that stuff. So just put a mixture of different baits out there. Highly recommend investing in bait stations just to keep any pets and animals and kids safe that are through the nursery. And I tend to put, a brick of each in each bait station, and then that way I know they're not building up immunity to one specific type of bait that I'm using.
Don't get cheap numbers, use plenty.
Correct.
Yeah. And Jack wants to know best ways to overwinter without heat, because you're talking about a minimally heated house.
Yeah, and we'll touch on that shortly here.
All right, beautiful. We'll keep going.
So here's an example of a cold frame, all tidied up, ready for winter here. And just some things to point out as you're looking at this slide. I try to keep everything away from the outer edges of the greenhouse by at least a couple pot widths. So there's a good 1.5 feet or so between the last edge, the last row of pots, and the outer edge of the greenhouse there. And what that does is it keeps the plants away from that extremely cold edge. If you would put plants tight up against that, you're going to see probably some cold damage on the outer edge of the greenhouse there. And everything's clean. There's no lead laying on anything, and the ornamental grasses are all trimmed back and stuff. So we don't trim them to the crown, but we trim them to where the green starts, and you don't want to trim them too tightly. The plants weren't fully dormant when we trimmed at that point, but we want to try to remove as much as possible to alleviate any kind of buildup of moisture. And then again, another house for rodents. And then also you notice in here the way the pots are spaced. Everything is extremely tight together. I tend to use a checkerboard pattern because I find that leaves less amount of air gap in between the containers, so that also alleviates the temperature swings down at the soil line. You want to try to keep that as tight as possible, and it tends to work out much better that way. And in this greenhouse here, this is in the fall, so once temperatures started to freeze more consistently, I would then go in there with a 3-ounce frost blanket to cover all those up. And I'm in a zone 6 here, 6A. You could probably do this method depending on the types of plants up to like a zone 5A or so. I'd feel real safe about it. It's when you start getting colder than that, I really am more concerned about getting more minimal heat in there, just to kind of take the extreme temperatures out. But again, this is white poly here. And then, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about heucheras, is watching the temperatures. We had some days that were 40s, in the mid 40s to almost 50 degrees in late December, early January. So I ended up uncovering everything and then opening the doors to allow it to ventilate. So as I mentioned in the slide before, we talked about a couple of these things, but it's definitely something that you want to look at investing is that 3-ounce frost blanket. You typically expect about 8 to 10 degrees of extra protection from that, and it's very inexpensive. I think I picked up some rolls of 15 by 250, and I think they were about maybe $250 a roll. So it's really cheap insurance to keep those plants happy and safe through the winter. So here's an example of some plants I took pictures of just a couple weeks ago here at Walters. And these were all plants kept in a 38-degree greenhouse. These are dormant plants that were planted from a 72 count plug in late summer. So this would have been like kind of like a mid-August to late August in that time frame there. And the one on the left is Pulmonaria twinkle toes. So again, we're looking for a plant that kind of gets the outer edge of the pot. It's not super full yet, but it's really looking sharp, but a good healthy root system on there. And those are actually beginning to flower out in our cold greenhouse right now, because Pulmonaria do flower under pretty cold temperatures. And then the plant on the right is Leucanthemum Daisy May in a full 1 gallon container, not a trade gallon, and that was from a 72. But just notice the number of breaks that are in there. That's really ideal to getting a beautiful looking plant for spring forcing. There's no pinching required. I just pretty much can take this plant, move it into a 55, 60 degree greenhouse and just let it come into flower. And it just works so much easier than trying to plant a larger plug in the spring and do a lot of pinches. And here's a batch of heucheras. A batch that was planted in late July, early August again from a small plug. And this is a variety that really blooms its head off. This is silver gumdrop. And again, the flowering type heucheras, I'd highly recommend doing late summer, early fall. But if you're just going for foliage, I know some of them are just mainly foliage plants, then I have no problem planting those in the spring from a larger plug. Now, getting in the forcing stage, this is that same batch that we took a picture of in the cold, Daisy May on the left there, just starting to elongate. It's in a 55 degree greenhouse, and then also Banana Cream on the right. Nice dense plants, and should yield some beautiful flowers. And Dianthus is another crop I love doing in late summer. I kind of probably almost put these to midsummer. To end up with these nice full containers like this. But so what you see is a 72 count that was put into a full 1 gallon or 4 quart gallon. And these were planted the end of July, and we did not do any pinching to that plug, and they filled up beautifully. They get about maybe a half inch or so away from the outer edge of the pot in the cold. And then they continue to, if you put them in a 35 to 38 degree greenhouse, you'll be surprised that these plants continue to grow through the winter months. So you'll get some slight bulking when they're held at a cooler temperature like that. And then we brought them into 55-degree greenhouse, and 6 to 8 weeks later, they're full of buds like this, and you cannot expect to get anything like that from a plug planted in the spring. So you'll be battling pinching flowers off before the plant's bulked. And some trials I conducted a few years ago. These are some of the more compact Monardas. This is part of my pink. And the one on the left is a trade gallon that was planted from a large 20-count plug in the spring. This is a vernalized plug. And then the one on the right was planted in late summer as a 72-count small plug into a full 4-quart 1 gallon. So you can see the increased branching effect that you have there, as well as each stem has a flower on there, so probably quadruple the bud count that trade gallon would have when it's planted in the spring.
Jeremy, how would you price those two plants? You got a lot more value there on the right-hand side.
Definitely. I would probably, I would think something could go like, probably 50% more for that full 1 gallon. I mean, that's an impulse item to me right there compared to just a standard, row or bench run perennial that's on the left.
Mm-hmm. Lower input cost, more time though.
More time, but really, I would say there's less effort put into it as far as going back and revisiting that crop with the handling and stuff.
Very good.
And then Ligularia, this is one that really impressed me because this can be a tough one to bulk up sometimes. And so the one on the left was a spring planted 20-count plug into a full 4-quart 1 gallon, and the one on the right was a 72 planted in summer. And I wish I took a photo of the flowers when they came on these plants, but the one on the left, it only had a single small flower, just barely came above the foliage, and the one on the right had, I can't remember if it was like 4 to 6 big flower scapes on it. So it's just an amazing plant. So it really gives you more of the mature attributes that the plant shows in the garden. And we'll kind of brief you some cultural information here on some long-term perennial crops. So these are plants that we recommend growing the season prior just because they are slower to bulk. So first one, Amsonia. This native plant does benefit from being bulked in late spring to early summer. We offer this as bare root as well as a plug, but I really see the benefits of using that plug and planting it. Like in Michigan here, I would look at the last week of May, first week of June, put it directly outside into a 1 or 2 gallon container, and it really yields beautifully for the following season. You have, I would say, 4 to 5 times the number of eyes you would see from a bare root plant. And that goes along with Baptisia. Amsonia and Baptisia are going to be pretty much the same cultural information if you would look that up on our website. Both of these benefit from the long bulking period, but it's really to develop those eyes. It takes a long time to get a nice full plant. The bare root does yield you a quick turn, but again, it's still not going to be as full as what you would see from a 72 planted late spring to early summer. And then Helleborus, we'll talk a little bit about that. They need cooler temperatures, so that's why we kind of request that you think about growing them in an off season. And then also hostas, they do take a long time to develop to get a number of eyes, as well as they require long days to form roots in bulk. So some tips for Amsonia and Baptisia. As I mentioned, we want to plant the small plugs in late spring for the following season's sales. And bare root is the best option for a quick turn in the spring. With the plants, you want to plant the crown slightly below the soil line as far as bare root goes. If you're doing plugs, we recommend that you plant the plug with one node of the stem below the soil line. So you're actually going to plant these deeper than what you would plant most plugs. And the reason behind that is we've done a lot of testing, and we found that by getting that extra node below the soil line, you're going to gain more eyes for the following season. So it's very beneficial to get that plug. So it's almost like you're re-sticking a cutting. So just get that plug a little deeper in the container. And then you're going to feed at 100 to 150 parts per million at each watering. And then these are plants that love a lot of sunlight. They love the heat in the summer, so it's best to grow them outdoors in direct sun. And then I also have trimmed these plants to help shape them a little bit, Because with Amsonia and Baptisia, you're going to notice that before they're vernalized, they're just going to pretty much grow sideways. They're not going to grow upright like you typically see that with a plant's habit. So it's important to go back and remove some of the extra foliage. I typically will trim them back to the edge of the pot, just to kind of keep things tidy here in the nursery. So here's an example of what you can expect from a plug planted in late May, early June. So there's a fresh Baptisia cutting just stuck in a plug. And once you plant that in the container, the following season, this is a photo of Baptisia Pink Lemonade that I took from our cold house a couple weeks ago. And you can see all the new eyes starting to protrude above the soil line there. And you'd be surprised, there's actually a lot of them below the soil line too. So just what I see exposed there is probably about 15 eyes. And I would expect anywhere between 15 and 25 eyes on these plants, where a typical bare root plant planted in the spring, you may only get about 7 or 8 eyes on there. But the thing is with bare root, you disturb that plant. You dug it out of the ground. Baptisia don't like to be disturbed. So we find that some of the eyes actually stay dormant. They're kind of a backup for the plant if some of the other stems crack off. But I find with the ones planted from plugs and that are in the container, they actually will utilize a majority of those eyes. You won't have half the eyes stay dormant. So you end up with a really, really full plant. And then another thing I see a lot with bare root Baptisias is some growers actually end up planting them too high. Because they have a long root system, you can trim some of that off. I would avoid trimming too much of it, but to get those, you want to get those eyes set below the soil line or slightly below the soil line. You may have some of the taller upper eyes poke through a little bit, but you want to get that buried correctly.
Question about air pockets at this point. I'm talking about planting where how much action should pressure apply to keep the air pockets out, especially a lot of mirrors in there. Is the watering intake of air pockets?
Okay, I thought a little bit. I think you have some sound issues there, Chris, or if I do.
Air pockets. Can you get that?
Yeah. So air pockets is really important with Baptisia because they have that larger root system. So you want to make sure when you're planting that, you're holding that plant in the center of the pot, you're filling the soil around it. And once that's about 3/4 of the way up the plant, I tend to try to use my hands and push some of that down underneath the crown of the plant there where the roots start to spread out, because that's where that void tends to be. So you want to make sure you fill it in with soil, but then also the thorough watering really helps with that too. But sometimes you can go back to the crop, and after it's been planted for a week or so, I can sometimes will stick my finger down there just to check some of the plants. And if it just falls in and caves in quickly underneath there, you know you had a big void there. So it's just something to keep an eye out for. But just make sure that you're planting properly. Take a little bit extra time to plant it carefully.
All right, a sound glitch that should pass.
So there's an example of an incorrectly planted Baptisia where the crown is above the soil line. I actually see a root kind of protruding out the side there. And then the next photo will have a correctly planted one. There you go. So the upper eyes are just slightly protruding out of the soil line. You can actually go a little deeper. It depends how long the roots are on that plant. But that is ideally where you want them, if not slightly deeper. So as far as vernalization goes, you want to vernalize them at 40 degrees or below for a minimum of 8 to 10 weeks. And then it's really important that you force these plants on the cooler side. Baptisia can stretch really quick. They're very fast growing once they come out of dormancy. So 50 to 55 degrees is the best temperature for the best results. And then you can also apply a PGR to them if you want to keep them more compact if you're shipping on a rack. We've done anything from like Sumagic at 1 part per million. Once the plant's 4 to 5 inches tall, we've done 5 part per million Sumagic sprays as well, and it tends to work quite well for them. So here's an example of that late spring planted crop. This is probably, by the looks of the plants, was probably early July. and plants are beginning to fill out in those 2-gallon pots, but you see the habit it has. It does not have that upright growth like you see a vernalized Baptisia does. It kind of lays out like a shrub. And then here's the Amsonia. This is probably more towards August here. And you see how full they are, and so you could do a light trim to those if you desire. And Helleborus. This is a plant that some people have good luck with, some people don't. I think it just has a few key pointers that you need to learn about to grow a great crop of Helleborus. And this is a plant that really does take a long time to get a nice flowering plant. So ideally, you want to look at planting in cooler seasons, so either in the spring, late winter to spring, or in the fall. And Walter's Gardens offers large and medium and small plugs in all the seasons there. I think the small plugs are only available in the spring, but the larger plugs are available for both spring and fall. And I'm a big fan of planting in the fall. You can put that large plug into the container, you vernalize it. You can expect about 10 to 15% flowering after the first vernalization. But it's when you actually take that plant and you grow it for another season there, either you step it up into a 2-gallon container or leave it in a full 1-gallon container, that after that second vernalization is where you see the heavier flower production. And some of these photos you see of a big hellebore in a garden, most of the time those heavy flowering plants really don't start showing those traits until about years 3, 4, and 5. So there's the different planting recommendations there. We have that for the northern and southern regions. And then, yeah, like I said, Hellebores love to grow in cooler conditions. They will go summer dormant on you. Once the temperature starts warming up, they start shutting down. So you got to consider these to be treated different than any other perennial. Don't continue to give them overhead watering. Don't continue to feed them heavily into the summer. They're not growing that time of year, so you want to back off the feed. They're not heavy feeders, so really a light feed of 50 to 75 parts per million nitrogen at each watering while it's actively growing is adequate. They do prefer to be more moderately moist when they're actively growing, and then in the summer they prefer to be kept slightly dry. As the temperatures rise in the summer months, when the plant starts to go dormant, you want to reduce that moisture, reduce the fertility levels, and then I tend to take my crop and I do the complete opposite I do with all my other perennials. I'm actually pushing these plants pot to pot for the summer months. And the reason for doing so is you're keeping that soil temperature cooler. The elevated soil temperatures are what can cause some of the melting away that you can see on these crops. That with the excessive moisture and overfeeding in the summer, those are all things that you want to avoid because that'll cause that crown and root rot to form. So we found just by pushing the plants together, it greatly reduced the soil temperature, and we had very minimal loss going through the summer months. And it's also really important to provide heavier shade throughout the summer. Here in the north, I'd say 55% shade is probably adequate, but as you get further south, you're probably going to want to look at 70% shade cloth. And again, you want to keep the temperature as cool as possible going through the summer on these plants. So for overwintering, you want to place the plants in a cold frame with white poly. And I avoid at all costs trying to overwinter these outdoors like I do a lot of my other perennials. Here in Michigan, being zone 6, I do put a lot of them just directly outdoors under a frost blanket. The problem with covering hellebores with frost blankets is, especially outdoors, is you're crushing the foliage with the weight of the snow. So that's why I typically like to bring these into a cold frame, so you're not damaging the older foliage at all. And then these plants will actually start to grow in late winter in your cold frame because they like the colder temperatures. So it's another reason to keep them protected from the outdoors. And again, bait for rodents, that's really important, especially with an expensive crop like hellebores. And then when temperatures begin to freeze, you want to make sure that you You place a frost blanket over them inside the hoop house, and that's pretty light, so it floats over top of the plants really nicely. But that just gives that evergreen top a little bit of extra protection in the extreme cold. And then again, avoid drastic temperature swings, and you actually want to start venting at 35. You want to keep that right around the freezing mark would be the best temperature to keep that at. And then if the temperatures rise above 35, make sure you're getting the frost blanket off the plants. So here's an example of some 1-year-old Helleborus. So this would be a 20 count planted in the fall, and this was the following spring. So nice full plants. Again, not much flower color yet. You know, they had a few flower stems on them on some of the plants, but the following season, and that'll be the next slide. These are what they look like if they're held through a second vernalization. So these are plants that were basically grown for about 1.5 years on a production site, and we cut back the old foliage once the flowers started emerging. You don't want to do that right away before the flowers start emerging. Leave that foliage on there to feed the plant, and then you can remove it. But you can see a nice full flowering plants. These are the ideal plants to sell at retail, where the landscape industry probably accepts green plants a lot quicker than a retail market would. We'll touch on a few things for Hosta production here. As I mentioned earlier, hostas really like long days to bulk and to form roots. You can jump to the next slide there, Chris. So you want to look at getting small plugs in late spring. So here in Michigan, I would look at like in early May or so, early to mid-May, and then 20 counts or larger plugs or bare root you can get in as late as June to bulk for the season, for the following season. They really require that long days to bulk. So if you try to try to grow a hosta from a plug with no supplemental light under cold temperatures, you're not going to be happy with any kind of root development. It's just not going to happen. So that's why we recommend to really think about growing these throughout the summer. And one thing I really like about doing hostas this way is they really yield a lot more eyes the following season. So you have that fuller plant again. And we recommend hostas be grown under 55% shade. So fertility rates for hostas is going to be around 75 to 125 parts per million nitrogen using a constant liquid feed. Or we recommend using a medium rate of a controlled release fertilizer. Generally, it's best to incorporate that in again, but you can also top dress if you're holding it from a prior season. And it's really important too with CRS not to get any built up around the crown, because you can cause crown rot with that and some burning of the roots. Make sure that you pull that and keep that away from the crown towards the outer edge of the pot. So you want to make sure you're reducing feed on the plant as it slows its growth in the late summer. And plants like hostas do not like high salt levels going into dormancy. So typically I am looking at using just a clear water to leach out the plants as we go closer to dormancy. Push those salts down to the bottom of the pot and out the pot, and you'll end up with a happier plant. And then hostas are best overwintered in a minimally heated greenhouse. Sometimes with unheated greenhouses, if the plants again are too close to the outer edges, if you uncover that crop and it starts to emerge, it either will not emerge uniformly, or you might not have the outer edge of the batch not emerge at all. So just keep that in mind. But if you are in an unheated cold frame, make sure again you're covering these with a frost blanket for the added protection. And here, again, some photos and results we get from some trials here at Walters. And again, the one on the left is a large 20 count plug planted in the spring. This is a vernalized plug. And you can see much more reduced in size compared to the one on the right, which was a 72 planted in early summer in the same size pot. So again, more perceived value there at retail. Warm season grasses. These are plants that require a lot of heat again. So it is excellent to plant these in the summer. So warm-season grasses like Miscanthus, Pennisetum, Panicum, Schizocarium, they just so extremely slow in the spring if you try to plant them then, or early spring. You tend to have more issues with yellowing because of pH issues and stuff for that time of year. It just seems like it's harder to get the iron to be pulled up in the plant at the time of year. So you avoid a lot of that by planting in the summer. And then really the amount that these plants bulk in the summer heat, a lot of times I've taken my 1 gallons from summer production, and in the fall I've been able, whatever I didn't sell in the fall, or I would just basically step those up into a 3 or 5 gallon container, and for the following spring I'm able to sell a nice large container of ornamental grass at a pretty low input cost. And a few overwintering tips for ornamental grasses. Some can be more finicky than others. I think probably the most difficult one would be Pennisetum, especially the further north you go. And some of the Miscanthus can be a little tricky too, but Panicums tend to be pretty easy, Schizocariums as well, as long as you're keeping them on the drier side. But again, they're best overwintered in a minimally heated hoop house or in a cold frame with the added protection of frost blankets again. And then ornamental grasses are a prime thing for rodents to dig into, so be sure that you're baiting liberally for those. And then also avoid overly wet conditions and overly dry conditions. So you got to make everything perfect, I guess, but try to have more consistent moisture throughout production. And also overwintering, you're going to have a much better plant. And then again, you want to place the plants real tight together to eliminate the airspace between the plants. And it is best to wait until the plants are almost fully dormant before you trim them back. You can stunt grasses if you remove more than half of the foliage when it's still green. So just be patient, let the plants go down. I try to leave them exposed to the elements as long as possible before I cover up the hoop house and before I trim them back. And then you'll have much more success overwintering. And that kind of wraps it up. So if we have any questions, feel free to ask.
All right, and we do have a few. How's my sound right now, Jeremy?
Much better.
Woo! That's 45 minutes in. There's always some kind of sound glitch. We haven't found out where that's coming from yet. Maybe it's me. Maybe I just started talking strange. Let's see. Jennifer wants to know, back to your dianthus slide. Those are some beautiful dianthus planted in late summer. Would you use the white poly in the winter to vernalize? I assume the question is yes. You love the white poly hoop house.
Generally, yes. Here at Walters, I have double clear poly on it because we're more of a greenhouse gutter connected setup here. I don't have hoop houses here. And we don't tend to change our plastic out for the different types of plastic throughout the season. So with that, we have power venting available. So I'm keeping that greenhouse at a consistent 38. So if we get a sunny day, as long as the outdoor temperatures aren't extremely warm, I can keep that greenhouse just as cool as it is outside. It's when you don't have power venting that the white poly becomes extremely important. You'll probably actually slow that winter growth that you have too if you're under white poly. So if the idea is for you to hold that crop longer in the spring and not use it for early spring sales, the white poly helps hold it dormant longer. So it's just some things to consider with that.
All right. Karen wants a clarification on the hellebore. You showed 2-year vernalized hellebore. So that was starting with a liner the first year, and then it was an overwintered gallon the second year?
Yes. So that was a 20 count plug planted in the fall, and then it was overwintered, and then grew from the spring, went dormant in the summer, grew again in the fall, and then vernalized again. So it went through two vernalizations. Now, Walters offers us those same 20 count plugs in the spring as well. So you can cut off the low crop time by buying that 20 count plug, planting it in the spring, holding it through the summer, and then holding it through one vernalization on your facility, and you would end up with something very similar.
All right. Susan wants to know, I think early on you talked about maybe fungicide dips. Would you, before potting, would you dip just the roots or the entire plant?
That was actually drenches, fertilizer drenches. Yes, drenches. So in the pot. So we typically use a portable injector here at Walters, and so you have to just follow your labels and the directions on that. But there's usually a set amount of the mixture that you want to get into each container. So it typically tells you how much to shoot for each pot.
All right. We've talked a lot about keeping things right around freezing. Rodney wants to know, what temperature do you start to see freeze damage? That's a broad question.
Yeah, it all depends on the conditions. I mean, if you're putting a frost blanket on, that can handle it much colder. You know, if you're getting a lot of sub-zero temperatures for a prolonged period of time, like in Minnesota or something, I mean, I can see how you can have more problems up there than trying to overwinter in here in Michigan. In Michigan, we have a nice microclimate with the lakes around us. But I would say that, you know, yeah, it's going to be more of a prolonged extreme cold that's probably going to cause you problems. But then again, those temperature swings, once a plant starts waking up and then you're not done with winter and you have some really cold temperatures come back again, that can be very damaging as well.
All right, now last bit of question here. We've got several more, but I'm going to tackle this one. Kind of talking about when the end of winter, timing on uncovering plants, removing them from the greenhouse, and spacing them out. How do you decide when you're going to start doing that?
Well, that's kind of up to when you want the crop to be ready. So if you're trying to get plants for early season sales and say a garden center is opening in late April, you want some leucanthemum in full bloom for that. You're looking at, you know, probably pulling those plants into a moderately heated greenhouse, say about 55, 60 degrees. It's probably going to take around anywhere between 7 and 9 weeks for that thing to come into full flower. At that temperature, obviously, if you push it a little warmer, it grows a little quicker. But I tend to be a grower that likes to force things on the cool side because you end up with a better looking plant. So it's really up to when you want that plant ready. And then also as you get into spring and those plants are still pot to pot and the temperatures outside are starting to warm up, if you notice things like heuchera starting to really flush out, that is the time you want to get those plants moved apart, when they're starting to touch, because you're just building up that thick canopy in there. You're going to lose the opportunity to get that nice, well-rounded plant if you leave everything pot to pot there. So, but it really is up to your production settings.
Great. Okay, great tips. And there's more questions, but we just can't get to them all. We've already run over our allotted time. However, Jeremy's gracious enough to share his email address at his current work, Jeremy@WaltersGardens.com. And you said this was good until when? April 31st or
March 30.
March 30. Thereabouts. After that, windgreenhouse@hotmail.com. And he'll gladly help you out with any of your perennial questions. Fabulous information. And if you want to go back, I know you do. You want to go back and pick up some of the thoughts, some of the details. Look at some of those photos again as quickly as possible. I will archive this webinar at our webinar homepage. Really, it's growertalks.com/webinar. Same place you can sign up for them. And speaking of signing up, if you are shipping product and you deal with ethylene, whether it's bedding plants in trucks or potted plants, you'll want to attend this webinar we've got coming up March 1st on managing ethylene in the supply chain. You can sign up for that at the same place where you can check out the archive of this webinar. So that's pretty much it. Jeremy, thanks so much for the great information, and congratulations on the new venture. We'll wish you luck, and we'll have to do a webinar from there sometime. How about that?
All right, sounds good.
All right. Well, for all of Jeremy's friends at Walters Gardens, the sponsor of this webinar, who I know are sad to see him go, and for all of my folks at Ball Publishing who are quite happy to see me go, at least for a little while, this is Chris Beatty saying so long, everybody.